It has been painfully obvious to those of us in this room that death has been an all too frequent visitor to Christ Church over the last few months. Despite our awareness that human life is short and that none of us are immortal, that knowledge and that awareness does not lessen our grief in any way. Life is short. And one day, absent the return of Jesus Christ in our lifetimes, one day death will come for all of us. My brother Dean, there's a certain ridiculousness to that, to the way we live our lives. My brother Dean used to tell a story about that ridiculousness. He said, think about the events that we look forward to in the course of our lives. When we're young, we look forward to being 5 or 6, so we're old enough to go to kindergarten. Once we're 5 or 6, then we look forward to being 10, because that's double digits. And then 13, because then we're a teenager, and then 16, so we can drive, then 18, so we can vote, 21, so we're legally an adult, and then maybe 24, because at 24 you're old enough to rent a car. After 24, what do we look forward to? 65! At every stage of life, we look forward to the next big thing. And sometimes we become so focused on the next big thing that we get tunnel vision. We get tunnel vision and we fail to enjoy the gifts and the joy that we have in the present moment. But at the same time, excuse me, particularly as we attend the funerals of our friends, we notice that the time we have left is escaping us like the sands in an hourglass. But if death is a common experience for all of humanity, how do we feel about that? If we're honest, most of us try really hard not to feel about that. We try really hard to keep our minds on other things and ignore the passage of time. As much as humanly possible, we try not to think about death. But surprise, surprise, that's the subject of today's conversation. So the question arises, if we're going to talk about death, what should we think about death? And as we think about that, we begin this morning by considering the story of the Valley of Dry Bones contained in Ezekiel chapter 37. In that story, which you will find in today's bulletin, but which I will not read, most of it, God calls upon Ezekiel while he and the people of Israel are in captivity in Babylon and are grieving the loss of their freedom, their nation, their temple, and their worship. And God's call to Ezekiel gives him a vision of an enormous valley full of dry bones. And God calls upon Ezekiel to prophesy to the bone. And he does. First, he calls to the bones in the name of God, and as he does, the bones come together. Tendons and muscles form over the bones, and skin covers them. And then God calls upon Ezekiel to prophesy breath to the dead, to call upon the 4 winds to breathe into them and give them life. And he does. And the winds come, and breath enters the body, and they come to life, and they stand on their feet, a vast army. And God said to Ezekiel, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore, prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, my people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel, and then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord, when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live. And I will settle you in your own land, and then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, that I have done it, declares the Lord. Figuratively, the people of Israel were dead. They had lost their homes, lost their families, lost their nation, their temple, their worship, and by their way of thinking, they probably had lost God. They were a people who were as good as dead. But God calls to them through his prophet Ezekiel and declares that he will bring them up out of their graves, return them to their lands, and that they will live again. God declared that exile was not the end, but that their lives would one day be returned to them. That's a nice story. It's a nice story about grief and sadness and depression and exile, and it's a nice story about God overcoming figurative death. But it's not the end of the story. In John chapter 11, we hear a story about Jesus overcoming the very real death of his friend Lazarus. That story's a little long. It's worth reading. But I'm going to skip some of that. The whole story's in your bulletin. You can read it. I'm going to skip parts as we go along. And that story sounds like this. A man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha, and this particular Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same Mary who poured perfume on the Lord Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, that Mary. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When the message got to Jesus, when he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, and this is the strange part of the story that we stumble over, he loved Martha, he loved Mary, he loved Lazarus, and so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. Skipping to verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know, even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, he replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world. skipping ahead again. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and she saw him, she fell at his feet. She said, "Lord, if you'd only been here, my brother would not have died." And when Jesus saw Mary weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit, troubled. "Where have you laid him? Come and see." "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. And the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb, and it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone." "The Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been in there for 4 days." Now, as an aside, we've talked about this before, we remember that the timekeeping system of the ancient people, of the people of the New Testament, any part of a day counts as a day. And so if Lazarus was buried in the evening, that counts as the first day. And if Jesus stood in front of the tomb at the crack of dawn, that counts as the 4th day. But even if both of those things are true, and they're just portions of a day, Lazarus was sealed inside the tomb without food, without water, in the heat of the day for at least a minimum of 60 hours. There is no way, in my mind, there is no way that Lazarus was not completely, thoroughly, entirely dead. And Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and he said, "Father, I thank you, for you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people who are standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen, and there was a cloth across his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes. Let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. Now, while Ezekiel was wrestling with figurative death and received God's promise of restoration, Jesus overcame the very real death when he restored Lazarus. And Jesus did the same on several other occasions when he raised the dead to life, and ultimately when he rose from the dead after his own crucifixion. But why is that important? Why is it important for us as we mourn with our family, with our friends, as we grapple with our own mortality in the 21st century? Why is that important? It's important. It matters because of the power that Jesus repeatedly demonstrated over death. It matters because of the resurrection on Easter morning. It matters because those things point us toward an understanding of death that Paul articulates for us in Romans chapter 8. In Romans chapter 8, Paul explains, the mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of flesh cannot please God. You, however, are not in the realm of the flesh, but are in the realm of the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, they do not belong to Christ. But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, Spirit gives life because of righteousness. If Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, He who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of His Spirit who lives in you. Paul sums up all of today's conversation by reminding us that Jesus has the power over life and death. God returned life in their home nation to the people who were exiled in Babylon. Jesus restored the life of Lazarus and several others. And Jesus suffered on the cross and died and rose to life after 3 days in the grave. And Paul reminds us that if the Spirit of Jesus Christ lives in you, then death is not the end. Sorry. If the Spirit of Jesus Christ lives in you, then death is not the end. Like Israel, like Lazarus, and like Jesus, death becomes only the middle between one life and the next. A death sandwich, if you will. Death is just the middle between one life and the next. Death is not the end. It is only a transition. Well, we become something new, something different, something eternal. In the movie The Pirates of the Caribbean, Davy Jones famously asks shipwrecked sailors, "Do ye fear death? Do ye fear the dark abyss?" The answer of Scripture is no. We need not fear death. Mostly because we don't plan on staying there very long, if at all. Our transition through death may be so brief, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in the twinkling of an eye, that fast. Our transition from this life into the next may be so fast we don't even notice. If the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, He who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of His Spirit that lives in you.